The 14th of August, 1938, 3:42 a.m. FBI wiretapping station, Lower Manhattan. Agent Robert Morrison was listening to Lucky Luciano's phone conversations when he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Tell Marco the grocery store number is active, and Giuseppe Monday is the regular program." The words seemed innocent enough, like a businessman discussing routine matters with associates. But Morrison had been monitoring Luciano's calls for 6 months, and he was beginning to suspect that these casual conversations were something far more sinister. What Morrison didn't know was that he was listening to the activation codes for the most sophisticated assassination network in criminal history. Lucky Luciano's personal phone directory contained 500 names, and every single one was a sleeping weapon, waiting for the call to kill. To understand how Lucky Luciano created an invisible army of assassins hiding in plain sight across America, you need to understand the problem he was facing by 1938. The commission system he'd established 7 years earlier had brought peace to organized crime, but peace required enforcement. Territories had to be protected, agreements had to be honored, and challenges to commission authority had to be eliminated quickly and decisively. Traditional enforcement methods were becoming increasingly risky as federal law enforcement improved their surveillance capabilities and interagency cooperation. The FBI was developing sophisticated monitoring systems that could track known criminals across state lines. Federal prosecutors were building stronger racketeering cases that connected criminal activities to organizational leadership. Local police departments were becoming less susceptible to corruption as civil service reforms reduced political influence over law enforcement, hiring, and promotion. The old model of sending known gunmen from New York to eliminate problems in other cities was now virtually guaranteed to attract federal attention. Interstate transportation of criminals for violent purposes fell under federal jurisdiction, making every long-distance enforcement action a potential federal case. Moreover, known criminals traveling outside their normal territories were easily detected by law enforcement surveillance that had become increasingly sophisticated and coordinated. Lucky needed a new kind of enforcement capability that could operate without detection, strike without warning, and disappear without trace. He needed killers who weren't killers, criminals who weren't criminals, and an organization that didn't look like an organization. He needed to weaponize invisibility itself. The inspiration came from an unexpected source: his observation of how legitimate businesses operated across multiple states. Corporations like Ford Motor Company, General Electric, and Sears Roebuck had employees in every major city, but these employees looked like ordinary citizens, conducted normal business activities, and attracted no attention from law enforcement. Their corporate connections were invisible unless someone specifically investigated their employment records. Lucky realized that criminal organizations could adopt the same model. Instead of maintaining visible criminal enterprises in every city, he could place individuals who appeared to be ordinary citizens, but were actually sleeping operatives waiting for activation. These operatives would conduct normal lives, hold legitimate jobs, and maintain no apparent connection to organized crime until the moment they were needed. The recruitment process began in 1936 and took 2 years to complete. Lucky's associates identified potential operatives in every major American city, focusing on men who met specific criteria. They needed criminal experience, but no recent arrests that would attract law enforcement attention. Financial motivation, but stable employment that provided legitimate cover. And most importantly, the ability to kill without hesitation while maintaining the appearance of respectability. The recruitment was conducted through carefully maintained networks that ensured each operative only knew about his own assignment and his single point of contact within Lucky's organization. No operative knew about any other operative, creating a compartmentalized structure that would be impossible for law enforcement to unravel even if individual operatives were discovered and interrogated under the most aggressive questioning. Each potential operative was thoroughly investigated before recruitment. Lucky's intelligence network compiled detailed profiles, including criminal history, financial situation, family obligations, psychological profile, and most importantly, vulnerability to law enforcement pressure. Only men who met all criteria and demonstrated absolute reliability under stress were accepted into the network. Marco Benedetto in Chicago was typical of Lucky's sleeping operatives, a 34-year-old barber who owned his own shop on the South Side. Marco had served 3 years in prison for armed robbery in the 1920s, but had maintained a completely clean record since his release. He needed money to support his elderly parents and younger sister, who depended on his barbershop income. But he also possessed the specific skills that Lucky's network required. He was comfortable with violence, reliable under pressure, and completely invisible to law enforcement surveillance. Marco's recruitment was handled by Frank Costello during a business trip to Chicago in 1936. Costello visited Marco's barbershop for a haircut and gradually introduced the proposition over several carefully planned conversations. Marco would continue operating his barbershop and living his normal life exactly as before, but he would be available for special assignments that might be required once or twice per year. Each assignment would pay $1,000, equivalent to 6 months of his barbershop income, and enough to solve his family's financial problems permanently. The beauty of the arrangement was that Marco remained exactly what he appeared to be: a neighborhood barber conducting legitimate business with established customers who had known him for years. The only difference was that he now had a secondary source of income that required special services that couldn't be obtained through normal channels. Marco never learned about Lucky's larger network, never met any other operatives, and never received information about assignments beyond his immediate responsibilities. Giuseppe Romano in Detroit followed a similar pattern. A 29-year-old truck driver with his own small delivery business, Giuseppe had been arrested twice for assault in his 20s, but had avoided serious prison time through good legal representation and favorable circumstances. His trucking business provided perfect cover for traveling throughout Michigan and Ohio without attracting attention, and his financial struggles made him receptive to opportunities for additional income that could stabilize his business. Giuseppe's recruitment was handled by Tony Accardo, who used his labor union connections to arrange legitimate trucking contracts for Giuseppe, while simultaneously developing their special business relationship. Giuseppe would continue operating his delivery service exactly as before, maintaining the same routes and serving the same customers, but he would also be available for assignments that required his particular combination of mobility, reliability, and willingness to use violence when necessary. The training process for new operatives was subtle but comprehensive. Each man was taught communication procedures that would allow for secure contact while maintaining the appearance of normal business relationships. They learned basic counter-surveillance techniques that would help them avoid detection during assignments. Most importantly, they were trained in operational security measures that would prevent them from accidentally exposing the network through careless behavior or communication. By 1938, Lucky had established sleeping operatives in 47 states, with multiple operatives in major metropolitan areas and single operatives in smaller cities, where one man could cover the entire region effectively. The network included barbers, truck drivers, restaurant owners, construction workers, traveling salesmen, insurance agents, and dozens of other occupations that provided natural cover for the activities that Lucky's assignments would require. Each operative was given a specific telephone contact procedure that allowed for secure communication while maintaining the appearance of normal business relationships. Marco the barber in Chicago would receive calls requesting appointments for customers with specific names that corresponded to particular types of assignments. Giuseppe the truck driver in Detroit would be contacted about delivery schedules for particular clients, whose names indicated different operational requirements. The coded language was different for each operative, tailored to their legitimate business activities, and designed to sound completely normal to anyone who might overhear the conversations. The sophistication of the communication system was remarkable for its simplicity and effectiveness. No operative ever received direct orders or explicit instructions about violent activities. Instead, they received business-related communications that triggered predetermined operational protocols. The system was so carefully designed that even if law enforcement intercepted and recorded every conversation, they would find nothing that could be used as evidence in criminal prosecutions. The phone calls that FBI agent Morrison was monitoring in August 1938 were activation codes for specific operatives preparing for immediate assignments. Tell Marco the grocery store number is active meant that Marco Benedetto should prepare for an assignment involving a target in Chicago's Italian neighborhood, specifically someone connected to food distribution businesses. Giuseppe, Monday's the regular program meant that Giuseppe Romano should be ready for a standard elimination assignment that would require his trucking capabilities for transportation and disposal. What Morrison couldn't understand from listening to the calls was that he was hearing the coordination of a nationwide assassination network that could strike anywhere in America within 48 hours of activation. Lucky's phone directory had become a weapon more dangerous than any army because it was completely invisible to conventional surveillance and utterly undetectable through normal investigative methods. The psychological impact of the sleeping operative concept was as important as its practical capabilities. Other crime families knew that Lucky possessed unprecedented enforcement capabilities, but they couldn't determine the scope of those capabilities, identify the operatives involved, or develop effective countermeasures. The uncertainty created a form of psychological control that was more effective than actual violence, because it was based on fear of the unknown rather than fear of the visible. The first major test of Lucky's sleeping operative network came in September 1938, when Commission member Vincent Mangano began challenging Lucky's authority over territorial agreements in New York. Mangano had been building alliances with crime families in other cities, apparently preparing to call for a vote of no confidence that would remove Lucky from Commission leadership and restore the old-style boss system that had existed before the Commission was established. Mangano's challenge was particularly dangerous because it was being conducted through legitimate Commission procedures. He wasn't plotting a violent coup or organizing an armed rebellion. Instead, he was building political support for a democratic vote that could legally remove Lucky from power. This type of challenge couldn't be countered through traditional enforcement methods without undermining the Commission system that Lucky had created. Traditional enforcement would have required bringing gunmen from outside New York or using local associates whose criminal connections would immediately point back to Lucky's organization. Either approach would have attracted federal investigation and possibly provided evidence for racketeering prosecutions. More importantly, using obvious criminal methods against a Commission member who was following Commission procedures would have destroyed the democratic legitimacy that made the Commission system work. Instead, Lucky activated 3 sleeping operatives: a restaurant owner in Baltimore who specialized in Italian cuisine and had legitimate business relationships throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, a construction foreman in Philadelphia whose union connections provided natural cover for travel and business meetings, and a traveling salesman whose territory included New York and whose sales records showed regular visits to the city for over 5 years. None of these men had any known connection to Lucky or to each other. None had criminal records that would interest federal investigators. None would appear on any law enforcement surveillance lists or organized crime intelligence files. Most importantly, none had any apparent motive to harm Vincent Mangano or connection to commission politics. The Baltimore restaurant owner traveled to New York on completely legitimate business, meeting with food suppliers and visiting other restaurants in his industry to discuss menu ideas and supplier relationships. The Philadelphia construction foreman came to New York for union meetings that were part of his normal responsibilities as a local union representative. The traveling salesman's route included regular stops in New York as part of his established sales territory for industrial equipment. Each man conducted normal business activities for several days before the operation, establishing their presence in the city through legitimate interactions with real business contacts. They stayed in different hotels, ate at different restaurants, and maintained completely separate schedules that would never bring them into contact with each other. On the 23rd of September, 1938, Vincent Mangano was shot 3 times while walking to his car outside his Brooklyn social club. The shooting occurred at 7:47 p.m., witnessed by over a dozen people who provided detailed descriptions of the gunman to police investigators. The witnesses described a middle-aged man of medium build, wearing a brown coat and fedora, but their descriptions were too generic to be useful for identification and could have matched thousands of men in New York City. The investigation focused immediately on known associates of rival crime families, particularly those with histories of violence and connections to commission politics. Police questioned over 50 suspects, conducted surveillance on dozens of potential gunmen, and investigated every lead that suggested organized crime involvement. Federal agents joined the investigation because of Mangano's prominence in organized crime and the potential for interstate criminal activity. But the investigation never considered a traveling salesman from Ohio, whose sales records showed he was conducting legitimate business in New York on the 23rd of September. The gunman had returned to his normal sales route within hours of the shooting, resumed his regular customer appointments, and continued conducting business that had nothing to do with organized crime. His presence in New York was completely documented through legitimate business records. His activities were verified by multiple independent witnesses, and his behavior pattern was entirely consistent with his established professional routine. Vincent Mangano's assassination demonstrated the effectiveness of Lucky's sleeping operative network, while establishing the psychological impact that would make future enforcement actions even more effective. The murder had been committed by someone who was completely invisible to law enforcement investigation, someone who couldn't be connected to Lucky's organization through any conventional investigative methods. More importantly, other commission members realized that Lucky possessed enforcement capabilities that they couldn't understand, predict, or counter. If Vincent Mangano could be eliminated so efficiently and anonymously, anyone could be eliminated. The message was clear. Challenging Lucky's authority was not just dangerous, it was futile, because the challenge itself would never be seen coming. The FBI's investigation into Vincent Mangano's assassination lasted 18 months and generated over 3,000 pages of reports, hundreds of witness interviews, and dozens of surveillance operations, without identifying any viable suspects or developing any prosecutable evidence. Agent Morrison, who had been monitoring Lucky's phone calls, submitted a memo suggesting that the assassination might be connected to coded communications he'd observed, but his supervisors dismissed the theory as impossible to prove and too speculative to justify additional resources. Lucky's phone directory continued growing throughout 1939 and 1940, expanding beyond assassination capabilities to include intelligence gathering, political influence, and business opportunities. New operatives were recruited in cities that hadn't previously been covered. Existing operatives were given additional responsibilities that enhanced their value to the network, and the communication systems were refined to provide even better security and efficiency. By 1940, Lucky controlled a network of over 500 sleeping operatives distributed across every state in America. The network could strike multiple targets simultaneously, eliminate threats in remote locations that were far from Lucky's normal sphere of influence, and conduct operations that appeared to be random crimes, completely unconnected to organized crime politics. The psychological impact of the sleeping operative network extended far beyond its actual use for violent enforcement. Other crime families knew that Lucky possessed unprecedented capabilities, but they couldn't determine the scope of those capabilities or develop effective countermeasures. The uncertainty created a form of psychological control that was more effective than actual violence, because it was based on fear of the unknown. Federal law enforcement agencies were aware that organized crime enforcement had become more sophisticated and effective, but they couldn't identify the methods being used or develop effective investigation strategies. Traditional approaches that focused on known criminals and obvious connections were useless against operatives who had no apparent connection to criminal organizations. The sleeping operative network also provided Lucky with intelligence capabilities that conventional criminal organizations couldn't match. His operatives were embedded in communities throughout America, positioned to observe law enforcement activities, political developments, and business opportunities that could affect commission interests. Lucky Luciano's sleeping operative network established precedents that influenced both organized crime and law enforcement for decades. The phone directory that Lucky carried contained 500 names, but it represented something more significant than a list of contacts. It was proof that the most dangerous weapons are often the ones that can't be seen, that the most effective armies are composed of soldiers who don't appear to be soldiers, and that true power comes from the ability to strike anywhere, anytime, without detection or retaliation. On the 14th of August, 1938, FBI agent Morrison was listening to codes he couldn't crack, monitoring a network he couldn't see, investigating an organization that didn't appear to exist. Lucky Luciano had weaponized invisibility itself, proving that in the modern world, the most dangerous criminals are the ones who look exactly like everyone else.